This is an anti-ecological society. It is an anti-ecological society because it forces the great majority of people to function in an anti-ecological way. The very morphology of life today, its very structure, its very architecture, pits human against human, isolates human from human, and creates a law of survival in which grow or die, I'm all right, Jack, to hell with you, becomes the way in which we orchestrate our everyday lives.
At present, we face an environmental crisis. And just because we might hear the word crisis a lot, that doesn't mean that we should somehow be desensitized to it. Yes, in spite of corporate interests piling massive amounts of money into propaganda and disinformation campaigns in an attempt to convince the population that this is all some great big liberal hoax, the environmental crisis that we face is in fact very real. Indeed, if by crisis we mean a time of serious difficulty or danger, then the current environmental situation can almost certainly be described with that label. Let's examine the evidence for this, starting with the issue of anthropogenic global warming. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, this graph, based on the comparison of atmospheric samples contained in ice cores and more recent direct measurements, provides evidence that atmospheric CO2 has increased since the Industrial Revolution. Atmospheric carbon dioxide, until now, has never been above 300 parts per million for over 650,000 years, and data from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii indicates that atmospheric carbon dioxide levels reached 400 parts per million in May 2013. Now, carbon dioxide has the effect of trapping heat, which was first discovered in the 19th century by Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius. You can find out about this in his paper on the influence of carbonic acid in the air upon the temperature of the ground. The fact that carbon dioxide traps heat, the greenhouse effect, is pretty much as uncontroversial among scientists as the fact that the Earth revolves around the Sun. So if carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping gas and carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, what can we expect to happen to the global temperature? Well, if we put two and two together, we can expect the global temperature to rise. And this is exactly what's going on. Now, if we look at this animation from NASA's Scientific Visualization Studio based on temperature measurements from 1880 to 2012, blue indicating temperatures that are lower than normal and red indicating temperatures that are higher than normal, it seems pretty clear that the Earth has indeed been heating up. Temperature records from 4 different international science institutions pretty clearly demonstrate a long-term warming trend. Global warming is also affecting the oceans, and quite dramatically so. Due to the melting ice caps, global sea level rose by about 17 centimetres throughout the last century. The rate in the last decade, however, has been nearly double that of the last century. This continuing trend puts a large number of communities at risk of being destroyed by flooding. Oceans are getting warmer because of the increasing temperatures, and they've also become 30% more acidic since the Industrial Revolution due to increased levels of carbon dioxide absorption in the upper layers of the ocean, which is currently happening at a rate of 2 billion tonnes per year. They're also being deoxygenized to an extent as well due to nutrient runoff from agriculture and sewage. Now, this combination of deoxygenization, acidification and warming is exerting an intense evolutionary pressure on marine life, which marine biologists say cannot be tolerated for much longer, because they have led, these same factors have led to mass extinctions in the past. The criteria for another one is there, and if that happens, then that's us, we're done. Several skeptical science contributors worked together to publish a scientific paper which combined the land, air, ocean and ice warming data, and they found that for recent decades the Earth has been heating up at a rate of 250 trillion joules per second, or to put that into perspective, 4 Hiroshima atomic bombs per second. So, are human beings causing the temperature to rise? Well, over the last century, the burning of fossil fuels like coal and oil has increased the concentration of atmospheric CO2. This happens because the coal or oil burning process combines carbon with oxygen in the air to make CO2. The fact that we also drive millions upon millions of CO2 emitting cars around the world every day isn't exactly helpful either. 97% of climate scientists agree that climate warming trends over the past century are very likely due to human activities, and nearly 200 leading scientific organisations worldwide have issued public statements endorsing this position, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a group of 1,300 independent scientific experts from countries all over the world. The IPCC concluded that there's a more than 90% probability that global warming over the past 250 years has come as a result of human activities. They also concluded that human-produced greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide have produced much of the warming in the past 50 years. So, if we accept the overwhelming body of peer-reviewed empirical evidence, we can come to a conclusion that carbon dioxide, a heat-trapping gas, has been continuously accumulating in the atmosphere over the past couple of centuries due to industrial human activities. Because of the greenhouse effect, the planet is beginning to heat up at an unsustainable rate. Ice caps are melting, oceans face warming, acidification and deoxygenization, and all of this and more could have potentially devastating effects on the natural environment and its inhabitants, including us. Now this should immediately lead us to start asking questions about the industrial economic activities that are being carried out. How are the resources that we extract from the environment being put to use? How are production, distribution and consumption being managed? Most importantly, are our methods of producing and allocating goods and services conducive to the creation of an ecological society? Well, currently the dominant economic system around the world is a capitalist-oriented market economy, propped up by usually high levels of state action. Now there are problems over what to call this for a few reasons. The main one is that capitalism, being defined as a system in which the means of production are owned privately and goods and services are exchanged for profit in a self-regulating market economy, has never existed without the state intervening in order to protect the owners of capital from the rest of the population, and thus violating market principles in their favour. Now some people call this crony capitalism as though to distinguish it from real capitalism, whatever that might be. Now this is problematic primarily because, well, it's happened every single time it's been attempted to be put into practice. And so maybe there isn't much point in actually making that distinction. Or perhaps the more appropriate distinction would be the capitalism that exists in the head of the market fundamentalist and the capitalism that actually exists in real life. Liberals, on the other hand, often refer to this system of the state intervening in order to keep the capitalist economy running as a mixed economy. Now, there are problems with this as well, I think, primarily because it conveys the idea that there are two distinct and separate forms of organisation that are being used, as though the state is socialism and the rest is capitalism. However, I don't think that's accurate. I think that we're dealing with a single totality. Now, what exists is a mutually beneficial relationship between private owners of capital and the state, the latter inevitably coming into existence if private ownership of capital is implemented. Now this is what Noam Chomsky refers to as really existing capitalist democracy, or RECT for short, and I believe that this is the most appropriate term for describing our current system. Now under RECT there are, generally speaking, two main routes that the state may take when protecting capitalism: social spending or military spending. Now of course the lines are very blurred and so on, but those are the sort of categories that we might talk about. Now, after the Great Depression, there was a big debate in the American business press in the 40s over which route was to be taken. Now, the trouble with social spending is that it's redistributive, and it has a democratizing effect. For example, people are going to want to know where you're going to put a hospital. They're going to want to know what kind of healthcare they have access to, for example. Now, on the other hand, military spending is redistributive as well, but in the right direction, that is, upwards. And it doesn't have a democratizing effect on the same in the same sense. It doesn't have that unfortunate defect of encouraging public participation in the political process. Can you guess which route was taken? Although there was some social spending, yes, for quite a while now the American state has been engaged in a policy of aggressive military Keynesianism in order to expand and protect private power while sustaining the global dominance of the American state, whose military spending accounts for 39% of global military expenditure. As well as being by far the largest military on the planet, the US Department of Defense also happens to be the single largest consumer of oil in the world, at almost 100 million barrels a year. And as we know scientifically that fossil fuel consumption is the main contributing factor towards carbon dioxide accumulation in the atmosphere, we can therefore conclude that the massive US military is definitely contributing a fair bit to global warming. Now, although it's certainly the biggest, the US isn't the only military state out there, but in fact it's one of 206 states around the globe, 185 of which happen to be military states, performing the rather useful task of defending themselves from the threat that they created in the first place. States are primarily concerned with perpetuating their own power and competing for global dominance. They are not sentient moral agents like you or your friends, and they should not be treated as such. States are machines with the capacity to go to war at any second, and they are operated by people who like power. This is a recipe for disaster. Globally, the money spent on maintaining military institutions is almost 20 times greater than the combined money spent on providing basic healthcare, nutrition, water, basic education, and reproductive healthcare. That, to me, is sickening. Militaries require a lot of resources to maintain, even during peacetime, and even more during wartime, of course. The environmental impact of war is particularly destructive, not only because of the masses of fuel required to actually carry it out, but also because the activities involved are actually directly destructive to the surrounding environment. War leads to resource depletion, and resource depletion leads to war. To return to the US in particular again, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in charge of the imperial military machine that's been built up over the years doesn't make the blindest bit of difference, partly because imperialism is basically built into the American government as an institution, and partly because the whole political system is a fucking plutocracy. That is to say, it's ruled by the wealthy. The more money you have, the more political representation. The less money you have, the less representation. And given how extremely stratified the US is economically, the vast majority of the population are completely disenfranchised, while the wealthy few effectively get to dictate policy. Now, while this happens, the American public have to be kept largely unaware of the fact that they're living in a militaristic plutocracy and the environmental degradation that results from such a system, primarily because if they were aware, then they would probably do something about it, and the guys in power don't want that. As such, there's been a concerted effort from business and government elites to try and convince the population that it's not even happening, or that if it is happening, we're not responsible for it, in order to prevent anyone taking serious action. In 1969, Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act and created EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. The US Chamber of Commerce, a corporate lobbying group, has recently been involved in attempts to urge EPA not to regulate carbon, instead suggesting that populations can acclimatise to warmer climates via a range of behavioural, physiological and technological adaptations. In other words, when they're asked to not so heavily pollute the environment all the time, then basically they're saying, yeah, that's just the way things are. The rest of the population, you're just going to have to adapt and basically change your biology overnight. Yeah, that's a fairly modest proposal, don't you agree? ExxonMobil, an American multinational oil and gas corporation, has been funding 40 different organisations seeking to undermine and deny the scientific consensus on climate change. ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers also support the American Legislative Exchange Council, another corporate lobbying group seeking to undermine science and prevent action against climate change. As well as opposing action on climate change, the major institutions of RECT are also committed quite enthusiastically to going in the opposite direction and exacerbating the problem further by finding new ways of extracting fossil fuels from the environment in ways that are extremely destructive, such as fracking and deep-sea drilling. George Osborne has recently been banging the drum in favour of a shale gas energy revolution, an orgy of profit-making that will tear apart communities and even further concentrate wealth into fewer and fewer hands. While this destruction continues, the public are largely unaware of it, partly because of relentless propaganda campaigns, and also because, under RECT, the mass media, being a system of private companies selling audiences to advertisers, disseminates information in order to reflect the interests of large private corporations. And so the public have to be marginalised completely with celebrity gossip, sports, action movies, Hollywood, fucking astrology, religious fundamentalism and all that shite. The education system in RECT has a similar function of destroying the critical faculties of the population. It's selection for obedience, training people to be workers so that they will follow orders. I mean, this completely undermines the creative thinking that's required to get us out of the environmental crisis, because we need to figure out ways to make a small amount of resources go a long way. That takes ingenuity, and we can't do that if we try and stamp it out all the time. Suppose you have a community of 20 houses. Each house has a lawnmower, and for most of the time the lawnmowers aren't used. It would be a far more reasonable and conservative use of resources if we had one or two lawnmowers shared amongst the community that would be managed democratically and cooperatively. It would be far more reasonable, because otherwise you're just wasting resources. And yet, in spite of this being a fairly reasonable proposal, a very rational way of managing resources, it's better for the consumer economy to have 20 different lawnmowers sitting unused in 20 different sheds, because you're buying more stuff. Now, standard doctrine under Recht for why we shouldn't share things is that, well, the old tragedy of the commons will happen. That's right, if we have cooperative, democratic control of resources, everything will be destroyed. So we should give it to the Koch brothers. Trust them with it. See how that works. Goods and services under Recht are produced for profit by private corporations, which traditionally have a very bureaucratic, centrally planned structure. That's something you're not allowed to say, incidentally, with the owners at the top. Now, the owners, the people who make the decisions over production, are incentivized to put their own interests first. And so whether the goods and services that are actually produced under Recht are actually beneficial or useful to the population is of little to no consequence. And in fact, quite often private companies will deliberately disregard the welfare of the population in order to make a profit. A vast amount of advertising is dedicated towards smashing the self-esteem of individuals and groups so that they become obsessed with conspicuous consumption of useless commodities that they otherwise wouldn't buy if they had the opportunity to live a genuinely fulfilling life. According to a study by Gallup of workplaces in over 140 countries, just 13% of workers feel like they're engaged with the work they're doing. 13%, that's tiny. And people say that this has something to do with human nature. People hate this. This is a complete catastrophe for humanity. There is an overall point that I'm trying to make here. We face a serious environmental crisis. This environmental crisis, if allowed to continue in the direction that it's going, would almost definitely end the possibilities for decent survival. The major political and economic institutions of our society are structured in an inherently anti-ecological way. The reasons for this are as follows. 1. Capitalism presupposes endless growth. In a world of finite resources, this is out of the question. Taken to its logical conclusion, it would destroy all of the resources available to it before collapsing in on itself. This is a death sentence. 2. Production is carried out socially by the collective, and yet the benefits from such production are allocated privately to individuals. This is a structural inequity, and as a result of this, the population doesn't have the power that it should have to fight back against private owners who don't have any regard for the environment. 3. Goods and services are produced for private profit rather than to satisfy social need. Corporate bureaucrats who make decisions over production are first and foremost concerned with making money for themselves rather than actually producing a product which is useful to society. As such, we often see the mass production of useless crap to satisfy made-up wants. 4. Even in situations where consuming a smaller amount of resources is both possible and desirable, capitalism encourages people to consume more. 5. Because there cannot be a disjunct between the educational environment and that of the workplace, and that the capitalist workplace is usually one of command and obedience, education follows the same structure. This dulls the creative and critical faculties of the population, making it very difficult for us to innovate to get out of the current situation we're in. 6. The media under capitalism, being structured in order to benefit the profit needs of large private corporations, serves a similar function, but by using diversion rather than direct command and obedience to control the public mind and discipline the population. 7. Elite business interests, those who are rewarded the most by our current system, are highly organised and class conscious. They understand that taking action on climate change, meaningful action, will be destructive to their profit interests, and that's why they're so aggressively lobbying against it. Some green activists claim that the environmental crisis is beyond left and right, or apolitical. To take this perspective is to treat the crisis like some sort of spontaneous aberration that just emerged all of a sudden from individuals all making poor choices all at once, then resulting in a collective problem. And therefore, to solve the collective problem, we can basically fix it by changing our individual lifestyles, reusing our shopping bags, cycling to work, and so on. This is well-intentioned but futile because it still retains the same assumption that free market capitalism assumes, that lots of individuals making individual choices based on their own rational self-interest or whatever you want to call it will then add up. That all of those choices will then add up, and the sum of that will be beneficial for all of the participants in the society. That's a pure fairy tale. The social, political and economic structures of our society shape the choices and the patterns of behaviour of the individuals participating in them. And our environment is being destroyed in a very calculated and systematic, pathological fashion. And the causes of such destruction lie at the heart of consumer capitalism and the state. And these structures cannot be reformed to be ecological in their nature, because doing that would be to construct something different altogether. Asking capitalism to limit consumerism and growth for growth's sake, and asking the state to limit war and the destruction of the environment that comes from war, is like asking a human to limit breathing. If political and economic institutions are anti-ecological at their core, then anti-ecological consequences will follow. Neither the state nor capitalism can be trusted to protect the environment, and so moving power from one anti-ecological institution to another is frankly a waste of time if you're trying to reach ecological consequences. So how much longer are we going to keep this economy based on irrational expansionism going before we take action? 20 years, 40 years, 100 years, can't go on forever. What do we have to gain from remaining subservient to these institutions which are systematically destroying the environment and ruining lives every day? We essentially have a state of affairs in which the political system boils down to a discussion over which power-craving, megalomaniacal psychopath is best suited to dominate the population. That's a sham. It's a complete fucking sham, and we know it's a sham. So why should we kid ourselves? Who the hell do these selfish, incompetent bastards think they are that they can just humiliate and destroy the population like this? They have made it clear, time and time again, over and over and over, that they don't care about us. Why the hell should we pretend that we care about them? This ecological crisis, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, is a threat to the species, and it is radical. Unless we are radical in response, the destruction will continue. And if we fight, we can possibly lose. If we don't fight, we definitely lose. We have one option, and one option only, and that's to create an ecological alternative to capitalism and the state. No more passivity, no more conformity, no more obedience, no gods, no masters. Our subordination ends now.